Okay, always a good place to start is at the beginning. And Genesis has to do with beginnings. I think it's Bereshith in the Hebrew, in the beginning. First words of Genesis. God created the heavens and the earth. And so we have this 6 days of creation as it's presented in Genesis. The first day being the creation of light. Let there be light, which is the first thing. Then there is the separation out of the sea and the sky. On the third day there is the creation of the land and the plants that go with that land. And then we have the corresponding days which fill up these areas. So in day 4, you have the sun, moon and stars. On day 5, we need something to go in the sea and the sky, which would be
sea monsters and birds.
Fish and the birds. And on day 6, something to fill up the land, which would be the animals and humans. Yes, animals and humans. Specifically, in the story, Adam and Eve. So we have the 6 days of creation. On the 7th day, it says that God rested. Rest becomes a very important concept through the Old Testament and into the New Testament. The rest is the Sabbath. It becomes enshrined in the 7-day week, the day of rest, but it also becomes the symbol of completeness. It's not just that God stopped working, but that God had completed what he had done. He enters into rest. We are, in a sense, to do the same sort of thing. And you'll notice in the New Testament that it talks about entering into, in Hebrews in particular, entering into God's rest. In other words, entering into his presence. There is a fulfillment and a completeness about this relationship of rest with God, being at peace with God. And so this becomes symbolic for a whole lot of other things to do with our relationship with God, which is there in the creation story right back at the very beginning. Very soon after that, we have the story then of 2 trees. I might even do it in green. The 2 trees represent 2 particular aspects of relationship. One is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the other is the tree of life. If you eat of the first one, the tree of knowledge and of good and evil, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, if you eat the first one, you fail to eat of the second. And that's exactly, of course, what happens in the story of the fall, that Eve is tempted to take the fruit from the first tree, and that fruit means that they are separated from the tree of life and cast out from the Garden of Eden. And so it's this thing that then becomes the foundation for our understanding of our human condition from then on. And that's why Genesis is so foundational in our understanding of who we are and where we're coming from and what is happening. So we have the fall. We have out of that fall, we see that there is a glimmer of hope. As the serpent who tempts Eve is then condemned and cursed, there is the prophecy, if you like, that the human being will damage the serpent's head, while the serpent will damage the human being's heel. And of course that becomes the prophecy later on for Jesus Christ, who by his death on the cross defeats Satan while suffering himself in the meantime. The fall then starts a whole series of events, which then from chapter 3, which is where the fall is, goes into chapter 4, and we have the story of Cain killing Abel. Not far after that, jealousy in this sort of situation. Not far after that, after Cain has killed Abel, we have the story of Lamech. Lamech, who is a man who is vengeful, who tells his wives, I've killed a man for insulting me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech is avenged 77 times. He's a man of violence. And we see this picture building up. Out of Cain and Abel, we see a magnification of sin taking place through Lamech. And of course, this continues on until we get this picture of a world that is so irredeemably bad that the only way to deal with it is to wipe out human existence. This terrible story of Noah and the flood, which I think very often is trivialized in children's stories, but it is one of the most horrible, terrible stories that you can imagine. And you can imagine how terrible the human race must have become for this to come about. The story of the flood is also, of course, as well as being a story of terrible destruction, is also a story of hope. In the ark are 7 people. There's Noah himself and his wife and his sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth and their wives. These 8 people emerge from the ark. We have this covenant then that God makes with humanity. He says, I will never destroy the earth in this way again. We see that human life appears to be shortened at this time too. That instead of living almost forever, or for hundreds of years, human beings are given a lifespan of 70 years, basically. So things change. Out of this time then, this takes us up to chapter 6, 7, around that area, and then we get the human race sort of starting off again through Noah and through all of his sons, and we come then to chapter 11 of Genesis, and we see the people who were supposed to be spreading and filling up the earth, stopping in one place and building themselves a tower which they hope will reach up into heaven, a measure of their greatness and where they think they're up to. God comes down from heaven almost laughing at what they're doing and saying, we can't allow this to go on. He scatters the people, their languages are confused, they cannot work together, the tower is left in disarray, and the people do what God had told them to do in the very first place, which was to keep moving outwards, keep going. That takes us, that's a sort of prehistory, if you like, this particular part of the Bible. Dating it is a difficult thing, although people have tried to do that. But during that whole time, from these first 2 chapters where everything is so good, you've got from chapter 3 through to chapter 11, which is just unremitting problems. And yet, in the midst of that, there is a little formula, and it's the Hebrew word toledot. And that word, and it continues through Genesis, means these are the generations of. And these generations are a list of the generations of these people who descend through from Noah and so on. In other words, through human evil, despite human evil, God is still blessing the human race with increase. These are the generations of them. You get these generations, these lists of generations, which look terribly boring when you first look at them. But you realise that they're there for a particular purpose, and they're dotted right through Genesis, this particular formula. Some people say this actually gives the whole structure to the book of Genesis if you're studying it. Toledot formula. We then move into chapter 12. Chapter 12 brings onto the scene Abraham. If we take a look at, there's the Mediterranean Sea, there's the Red Sea, and the Sinai Peninsula sort of comes around here, and you've got the Gulf, which sort of comes up this way, and round from the Gulf, around this way, going right round there is the Fertile Crescent. Across the middle, there is a desert, so you don't normally go that way. If you've got to travel from there to Palestine or to Canaan, then you'd go around the Fertile Crescent. Abraham and his family came from Ur of the Chaldees. I think that's still in the area of Iraq. And they moved up the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And when we sort of meet them, when the story really starts, they're in the town of Haran. God speaks to Abraham and says, I want you to move out of Haran. I want you to go to the country that I'm going to show you. And he makes various promises. One of the promises is, not particularly in chapter 12, but later on, is that I will give you the land that I will take you to. This would be the land of Canaan, which we know as the Holy Land. Sometimes it's called Palestine. The land of promise, the promised land, it's all the same place in this area here. So I want you to go to where I'm going to show you. I'll give you the land that I'm going to show you. I want you to go where I tell you to go. He said, I'll make you a great nation. I will make your name great. And he says, as well as that, I will bless the earth through you. We know, looking back at that, this is the start of the plan whereby Christ could come into the world and be a blessing to the whole world. It begins here, in a sense, most clearly with Abraham and with Abraham's descendants. I will bless you, he says. I will give you the land. I will make you a great nation. Your name will be great. And the earth will be blessed through you. The people of the earth will be blessed through you. We see a lot of stories that follow on from there with Abraham. His name becomes Abraham, being the father of the nation. He marries Sarai, whose name becomes Sarah. And God also takes with him his nephew Lot. And you remember the stories then of Lot and of Sodom and Gomorrah, which ensue from there. And you've got Lot, Abraham's pleading for these cities, and God listening to his prayer, and yet in the end destroying the city, but saving Lot out of that city. You remember too that Abraham makes various mistakes along the way. He pretends that Sarah is his sister rather than his wife, almost gives her over to one of the kings, and God protects him, protects their relationship, protects them, looks after them. You can see God's hand in Abraham's life because there is a plan for Abraham. There's a plan for his descendants. So you get the promise. This promise of a great nation doesn't seem to be coming true. And Abraham, you may remember, takes wife Hagar because he doesn't think that Sarah in her old age is going to be able to have a child. And Hagar has a child, Ishmael. And Sarah, in her jealousy, gets Hagar and Ishmael thrown out of the family. She goes, she wanders away. She also is protected by God. Ishmael is to become a great nation too, probably the forerunner of the Arab nations. And Abraham and Sarah are promised a son. They have visitors who come, the angels come and say, you're going to have a son. Sarah laughs. Abraham nevertheless believes, and sure enough, in their old age, very old age, Isaac is born. Abraham is then tested. He's told to take Isaac up onto the mountain and to sacrifice his only son. And as Abraham is about to obey, there's time that has him down on an altar to sacrifice him. As he's about to sacrifice him, the angel appears, the Lord God stops Abraham from making the sacrifice and provides the lamb or the goat that's in the thicket. And this goat takes the place of Isaac in terms of sacrifice. Isaac's life is spared. He becomes a type of us in some ways, that the Lamb of God takes our place, but he's also a type of Jesus in the sense that Abraham gives his only son. So there are two pictures there as we can gain from that particular story of Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah. In many ways, Isaac mimics the life of his father Abraham. He does the same sort of things. He tends to make the same mistakes. He too pretends that Rebekah makes out that Rebekah is his sister, and same sorts of things that he goes through. So Isaac is almost a poor reflection. But Isaac and Rebekah have two sons in particular. One is Jacob, and the other is Esau. Esau, the very hairy man. Jacob, the more, I guess you might call him a more intellectual, bookish type of person. If they had those sorts of people in those days. Esau, the hunter, the man's man, goes out and hunts and brings back food for Isaac. Esau is the eldest. Normally the blessing, this inheritance, these promises here, which have been told to Isaac, told to Abraham, then told to Isaac, these promises would normally have come through to Esau. He would have been the line through which all of these blessings would come to the whole world. Jacob appears to see the value of the birthright and gets Esau to sell his birthright, to sell this blessing for some soup. Comes back famished, and there is Jacob with the soup there, and he says, "Oh, give me some of that soup. I'll give it to you if you give me your birthright." He said, "Oh, I'm so hungry, I'm going to die anyway if you don't give me some." So he just throws it away. He has no idea of the importance and the significance, not just for himself, but the significance for the human race lies in that bowl of soup, and he gives it all away for that bowl of soup. And Esau then, when it comes to the time that the birthright is passed on from Isaac, Esau goes out to get some food for his father, to kill some game and to bring it back and to give it to Isaac, and then Isaac is going to bless him. Isaac's wife Rebekah hears what's going on, and she engineers so that Jacob receives the blessing, puts a hairy coat on him and dresses him up as Esau. He goes into Isaac. Isaac says, "Oh, you're back already," and they've prepared a meal, which seems like the real thing. And Isaac's suspicious, but he passes on the blessing to Jacob. Esau, when he gets back, it's too late. Once the blessing is given, the blessing is given. You can't, in that culture, you can't take those things back. You can't say, "I was fooled, I didn't know, I didn't understand." The words are said. Once the word is said, the blessing is passed on. Jacob has to get away. Esau's after his life. Jacob goes away. He goes to his uncle Laban. And there he sees Rachel. He wants to marry Rachel. And Uncle Laban says, "Yeah, you can marry Rachel, but you've got to work for me for 7 years." And he does that. And after 7 years, he gets married and finds it isn't to Rachel because all covered up. This is the thing against the burglars. She's all covered up and he can't see who he's marrying. He finds that he's married Leah, Rachel's sister, who's the oldest. Laban says, "Work for another 7 years, I'll give you Rachel as well." I don't know that he had to wait another 7 years before he actually married Rachel. He may have married her straight away, but the promise was that he would work. He basically finished up working 14 years for Laban. These two were two of a kind, of course. They were both as deceitful as each other. And Jacob is breeding the stock and making deals with Laban so that he's getting the best of the stock along the way. Some become his, some become Laban's. He's getting the best of it. Laban tries to keep changing the conditions of the work. Jacob keeps finding ways around, and Jacob finishes up as a very, very rich man. Eventually, he leaves with his wives. He's going to go back to Esau. And as he approaches Esau, he's very nervous about what's going to happen. He doesn't know whether he's going to lose his life. He sends the women on ahead with gifts and all sorts of other things to sort of appease Esau. And he has a wrestling match with this figure who appears. And as he wrestles, he's saying to this figure, "You've got to bless me. I'm not going to let you go until you bless me." His hip is brought out of joint. And we see this sort of picture of Jacob wrestling with God, and yet prevailing in the end, that God continues to bless him and to keep him. And Jacob then meets up with Esau. And as he meets up with Esau, Esau welcomes him. Time has done its work and has brought about healing, and they are able to embrace, and they make up. But the blessings are still to go through Jacob. Now Jacob, of course, then has family himself. He has 12 sons. And these 12 sons are Reuben. There is Issachar. There is Zebulun. Not necessarily in order, incidentally. There is Simeon, Levi. There is, where are we? Gad, Asher, Dan, Naphtali. Well, it sounds like something for moths. Joseph, and Benjamin. Benjamin was the youngest. How's that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I'm missing one. It must be Judah. Judah, of course, becomes very important. And in this story, Joseph, of course, then becomes the major character in the story from here on. Joseph is the one who has dreams about wheat sheaves bowing over to his wheat sheaf. He has a vision or a dream about the sun, the moon, and the stars all bowing down to him. And he's subtle enough to tell his brothers about this and then to tell his family about it. They are fairly indignant, the brothers in particular. "Do you think we're going to bow down to you?" Even his mum and dad said the same thing. "Do you think we're going to be worshipping you?" And their jealousy about Joseph is increased by the fact that Jacob gives Joseph a special coat, which seems to signify leadership and being of particular importance within the family. And Joseph, as he goes out to meet his brothers on one occasion, out in the desert, and they see him coming, they devise the plan, they put him down a well. First of all, they were going to kill him. They finish up putting him down a well, and as they see traders going towards Egypt, they say, "Well, let's sell him. We won't kill him, we'll sell him, and we'll make something out of this as well." They do a terrible thing, not just in selling him into slavery, but then in dipping his clothes in blood, and the blood of a goat, and taking him back to the father and saying, "Look, your son must have died." And leaving Jacob thinking over years and years and years that he's lost his son, a favourite son at that. Joseph goes down into Egypt. He's sold to Potiphar, who is a wealthy man, has a house, Joseph, because he's a good worker, because he's a good man, he's basically, apart from being rather unsubtle about it and sharing his dreams, he is basically a good man who loves God and follows God. And he is promoted to the head of Potiphar's family to look after everything that goes on in the household. And after a period of time, you remember that Potiphar's wife fancies Joseph, tries to get him to sleep with her, and he refuses. He makes a run for it. She grabs his cloak and then claims that he's tried to rape her. And of course Potiphar believes his wife rather than a slave, and Joseph is thrown into prison. In prison, Joseph finds himself with the cupbearer of the king, and also, as well as the cupbearer of the king, he finds himself with the baker. And during his time there, these two have a dream. The cupbearer dreams that he squeezes out the grapes into a cup and gives it to Pharaoh. And the baker has a dream that he's got baskets, 3 baskets on his head, and the birds come and take the bread out of the basket. They don't know what it means, but Joseph does. God has given him the ability to understand the meanings of these dreams. He says to the cupbearer, your dream means that you will go into the presence, you will be restored to the presence of the king once again. He says to the baker, your dream means that you will lose your head, it will be put up in a tree or somewhere, and the birds will come and eat it. Which would you rather be? Anyway, the cupbearer, as he is restored to the Pharaoh, Joseph says to him, if you get a chance, put in a good word for me. The cupbearer forgets until the Pharaoh has a dream himself. And Pharaoh's dream is twofold. One is that he sees 7 stalks with lots of grain on it, big fat ones. And then there are 3 very skinny ones come along, 7 skinny stalks come along and eat up the fat ones. Similarly, has a dream about 7 fat cows. Well, something like that anyway. That's a very fat cow. Times 7. 7 fat cows, the 7 thin cows come out of the river and they come to the fat cows and they eat up the fat cows, but they don't get any fat on themselves. The Pharaoh can't make head or tail of what's happened, what it's all about, and the cupbearer remembers Joseph. I know a fellow I met in jail, he can tell dreams, and Joseph is brought out to the Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, I believe that you're able to tell dreams. Joseph very promptly says, it's not me, it's God who gives me the ability to do this. God will tell you what your dreams mean. And as the dreams are recounted, Joseph says they're both the same thing, basically. You're dreaming the same thing both times. It's a prophecy. There will be 7 good years, and there will be 7 years of famine. And in the 7 years of famine, it will become as if the 7 good years have never existed. Pharaoh says, what shall we do? And Joseph says, well, I think you should put somebody in charge to manage the 7 good years, put stuff aside for the 7 bad years, and then you will have prepared for the future. Pharaoh says, well, you look like the guy. And he promotes Joseph from prison to suddenly being really second in charge of the kingdom. And of course, it's during this time that the famine is not just in Egypt, but has spread all the way up to Canaan, the land of Canaan, where Jacob and the sons are. And Jacob says, we're starving, we're in a bad way, but there's grain down in Egypt, they've saved it up. And he sends his sons down. They come before Joseph. Joseph recognizes them, they don't recognize Joseph. And there's this wonderful sort of interplay as Joseph tests them to see whether they've really changed, whether there's really anything different about them. He sets up Benjamin so that Benjamin is put into prison, and the sons go back to Jacob and say, oh, you seem to have lost your other son as well. And Jacob says, well, we've got to go back. And in the end, the way it all works out, with all this sort of toing and froing and all this intrigue that goes on, in the end, Jacob sends his sons back. Joseph reveals who he is. The sons are terrified. They think, we're going to lose our lives now. Here's this powerful guy that we threw down the well and sold into slavery. Now he's got power over us. And Joseph says those immortal words, that it wasn't you who did this, it was God's plan to maintain the people. That through Joseph, his brothers' lives would be preserved from the famine. It was all part of God's plan, and Joseph saw this clearly, what the brothers didn't see. And of course, Jacob eventually comes down into Egypt as well. Jacob dies eventually, and then the sons think, oh no, now we're for it. Now that Jacob's influence has gone, now he'll take out his revenge on us. But Joseph once again reassures them, no, this is not the case. This is not what's going to go on. This was God's plan for us and for our future, and the plan for the world. And of course, Genesis then finishes with Joseph dying. And Joseph, as he dies, says to them, when you will eventually leave this land and you will go back to the land that has been promised to you, to the land of Canaan. He says, when you do that, take my bones with you and bury them there, because that's where the future is. It's not here, but the future is there. This is a sort of way, this is a sort of diversion, but the real future is going to be back there in the land. And so Genesis ends. Joseph's body is embalmed. And we come to the second book of the Bible. The second book of the Old Testament. There are lots of books in the Old Testament. It's not going to take us as long to get through every one. There's an awful lot in Genesis. The second book then is Exodus. And Exodus opens up again, probably around 400 years later. Abraham was probably around 2000 BC, about 4,000 years ago. Exodus, probably around about 1400 BC, or some people say around about, somewhere around the 1200 mark. Depends which interpreter you're looking at and all the rest of it. But about 400 years later anyway, the Exodus starts to take place. We have Moses comes on the scene, Moses and the bulrushes, the people under slavery, God preserving Moses to take on a leadership position. He's found in the bulrushes. He's in the bulrushes, of course, because of the decree that baby boys of the Hebrews should be killed. And there's a great nervousness that this little ethnic group is becoming a very big ethnic group and is likely to take over in Egypt. And these foreigners, we've got to make them into slaves, try to suppress them, try to stop them breeding, and let's cut off the baby boys. Moses is preserved in the bulrushes. The princess finds him there. The princess takes him back to the palace, gives him an Egyptian upbringing, and also, of course, there's that wonderful thing where Moses' sister comes and says to the princess, "Oh, do you want me to find somebody to look after him for you?" And the princess says, "Yes, that would be very good," and then bring him to the palace. And of course, she goes back and gets a mother to look after. So Moses' mother finishes up giving him a Hebrew upbringing, so he knows who God is. And he gets an Egyptian upbringing, so he gets a great deal wider knowledge than he would have otherwise had as well. Moses fundamentally remains a Hebrew, remains one of God's people. And you may remember that one day he sees an Egyptian badly treating some of the slaves, the Hebrew slaves. He kills the man, buries the body, thinks no one's seen it. And then the next day when he's trying to tell one of the Hebrews to do something, he says, "Oh, you're going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian." And he realized that it wasn't secret at all. He's been discovered, he's been seen. He knows that the word is going to get out, it will get back to the Pharaoh, and his life will be finished. And so he flees from Egypt. He goes out into the desert, out into the Sinai desert. And it's there that he marries, he looks after sheep, and during one of those particular events, he sees a bush which is burning but not burning up. And as he draws near to see this unusual thing, a voice comes from the bush and says, "Moses, take off your shoes, take off your sandals, because the ground on which you stand is holy ground." And he says, "Who are you, Lord?" The Lord reveals himself as Yahweh, or what's sometimes called Jehovah, and says, "You are to go into Egypt, and you are to tell the king of Egypt to let my people go, to tell the Pharaoh to let my people go." Moses makes all sorts of excuses. "Lord, I'm not a very good speaker. Who should I say has sent me?" And in the end, God says, "I'll be with you. I'm going to. You don't need to worry." And Moses says, "Oh Lord, please send somebody else." That's his last excuse. "Please send somebody else." And Moses is sent with his brother Aaron, and they go and they confront Pharaoh. You remember there are the plagues which come upon Egypt, which are to tell the Pharaoh that his gods are not the ultimate gods, but that the God of heaven is the one who is the real God. And so things like the Nile, which is the waterway where life came from as far as they were concerned, the Nile is turned into blood, it becomes unusable. And God is saying to the Pharaoh, "You think this is your God? Look what I can do to this God that you have." There is darkness that comes over the sun God. God can bring darkness. The sun God is of no account in terms of Yahweh. And so these plagues go through, and the Pharaoh at times says, "Oh yes, I'll let you go, just turn this plague back again and I'll let you go." And the plague is turned back, things are restored, the Pharaoh changes his mind and says, "No, you can't go after all." And finally, there comes the time when God says to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel that on a particular day they are to take a lamb, they are to kill the lamb, and they are to take the blood of the lamb, and they are to put it around the doorposts of their houses. And this will be a sign that those who are within the house will be safe when the angel of death passes over. Where the blood is not on the doorposts, the firstborn of those families, the firstborn of the cattle and so on, will die in those particular families." That night, they were to take the lamb, they were to eat, and they were to eat standing up, and they were to leave. Then once they got the word, they were to leave quickly and to set out for the promised land. That night, the angel of death passes over. The firstborn of the Egyptian families dies. There's a great wailing in Egypt. It's once again one of those terrible stories of tragedy. And at the end of that time, the people of Egypt are giving their gold and their silver to the Israelites, saying, "Go, just get out, go. We don't want to have any more of this plague, these things happening to us." And the Israelites then move out of the land of Goshen, up in the top corner of Egypt. That's the Nile Delta. Goshen is sort of up here. They set out towards the Red Sea, or to the river, and there they encountered the Egyptians following them. They're in despair, but God tells Moses to put out the staff over the sea, and the seas part. They're able to go across on the dry land. They get to the other side just as the Egyptian army arrives, they go down into the sea bed, which is probably fairly muddy by then. They get stuck, the waters come back in, and the Egyptian army is drowned. And they are free. On that day, that Passover meal becomes the symbol of their freedom. same meal, of course, that Jesus eats with his disciples at the Last Supper, Thursday, which we named on Maundy Thursday last week. That Passover meal becomes too the sign of becoming a new nation, becoming a new people, of finding freedom from the oppressor and from slavery. It's the gateway. They're out in the desert, of course, and the Bible talks about something like 1 million people wandering around in the desert. And as they move around in the desert, they come to Sinai. And at Sinai, the place where the burning bush was, is the place also that God meets with Moses on top of the mountain, gives him the 10 Commandments. The people down at the bottom are waiting for Moses to come down, and he doesn't seem to be appearing, so they make a golden calf. They stop to worship the calf. And Moses comes down and he's horrified by what he sees. The people, the golden calf is ground up, they're made to drink it themselves, the gold mixed with the water, and the law is given, again, there's a second lot of law given. So you have the 10 Commandments, basically, and a lot of commandments that sort of flow on from that. And of course, that's where Leviticus comes in. The Bible, which a lot of the codes of the law. Also during the time of wandering through the wilderness, they receive information, or Moses receives information on setting up the tabernacle, which is the tent, a temple tent. It's like an enclosure of animal skins. I draw it something like this, might give you a better idea. The animal skins, probably something along that sort of line, like a walled enclosure, and then inside was an extra big tent, which would be the Holy of Holies. That's where Moses would meet with God in that particular part. It's also the template, basically, for the temple, on a similar sort of layout of the temple. Around the tabernacle, setting up the tabernacle, there would be the encampments all the way around on these different sides around the tabernacle. So it became the centre, it would be the centre of God being amongst them as they camped. And as the fire came by night, they would follow the fire by night, they would follow a cloud by day. When the cloud settled, then they would settle too, they would set up camp. So they would make their way through the wilderness. A lot of the laws that were given, the Levitical laws, had to do with the priesthood, it had to do with furniture, it had to do with a lot of stuff that was going to happen when they actually got to the land. So this is all about travel. It's all about this travelling into the land. You've got Numbers, which tells some of the stories along the way as well. Particularly, you hear from Exodus and Numbers, the way that people constantly mistrusted God and mistrusted Moses, turned their backs on God. They were complaining about water, they would complain about food. We don't have enough to eat. God sent the manna from heaven, this sort of flaky white stuff they would pick up off the ground, and they would be able to eat it during that day. During the Sabbath, or before the Sabbath, they would collect enough for 2 days. But on the other days, if they tried to collect too much, it would go mouldy. But it would keep on the Sabbath day. And so here again is God reinforcing the rest for the Sabbath, but also showing that He was the one who would supply their needs. He would be their provider. He would be their keeper. Water is brought from the rock to supply them with enough to drink. On another occasion, they're complaining, and God sends out snakes this is in the book of Numbers, sends out snakes which bite them. And they're dying, they're calling out for help, and God says, set up a serpent on a pole. When people look at the serpent, they will live. So it was a call for faith, it was part of the disciplining of the people. which is of course also the symbol for doctors, medical doctors these days, is the snake on the stick. Of course, in the New Testament, Jesus says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so will the Son of Man be lifted up, so that all who look to Jesus then find salvation, then find the antidote to the poison of sin itself. Jesus bears our sins in his body on the cross. So we have these pictures that constantly keep coming in from the Old Testament, not just this flow of salvation history which is going through, but these little insights as to what will happen in the future. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, as they draw near to the land, on the way you might recall that they were going to go into the land. They could have taken the land early in the piece. They sent spies into Canaan, and the spies, 10 spies came back saying, these great walled cities, they're like giants, they will never be able to take the land, it's no good, poor us, we may be better off going back to Egypt. And 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, come back with good reports and say, we can take this land, God is with us, it's got lots of grapes and wonderful things, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, wonderful place. They're out overruled. The 10 spies turn the people are wanting to go back, and God says, okay, you stay in the wilderness. You go 40 years in the wilderness, and that's what they do. It's the next generation then that actually gets into the land. And that generation that refused to take the first opportunity died in the wilderness. Eventually they get to the edge of the promised land, which is sort of around here. They've gone all the way down here, right round. They come up through Edom. Edom, incidentally, the descendants of Esau. And the Edomites make things a little difficult for them. I think they finish up going around the outside of Edom. They're not allowed to attack Esau's descendants. And they camp. They're on the hill just overlooking the Jordan. Moses gets a look over into the promised land, but dies without actually getting in there. And while he's there, at this particular point, he gives the law again. He says, look where God has brought you. Think back on your history. He gives them a little history lesson. He tells them the law again. He reiterates the law. And in Deuteronomy meaning second, nomos, meaning law, Deuteronomy, that's it. Deuteronomy, being the second law, he gives them the law again. He explains it all to them. And he says, okay, now you said you're about to go into the land, remember where you've come from. Remember these laws that God has given you. Moses dies, and he appoints Joshua, one of the good spies, who had been into the land. And Joshua becomes the leader of Israel. Those first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, sure, that's okay. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch. They're also known as the books of Moses. And he couldn't, well, it does talk about Moses' death, so we presume he didn't write that little bit. But maybe it was either him or somebody close to him wrote those 5 books. But they're known as the books of Moses, the Pentateuch. And there is a movement through from Genesis right through, as you see God's plan, moving through those promises to Abraham, moving through the promised land. Now they're at the border, and we're going to have a cup of tea or coffee, and then we'll come back and move into the land.